Good morning, Christina. So here we are for the first of our 5 video office hour sessions that we're going to be making as the course goes along and discussing issues that have come up in the office hours with the teaching fellows and from the general public. So why don't you get us started?
Great. So the first 2 questions that we received are conceptual. And I know that in your lecture on China and Vietnam, you presented us with an abundant list of potential causal drivers of this growth miracle that we have observed in China and Vietnam. And I know that Malesky and London also provide a bunch of potential reasons as to why China and Vietnam stick out. At the same time, I know that you said as scholars, we have to be very careful not to be selecting on a dependent variable when we're trying to make causal claims. So one of the questions that students had were whether you can clarify what that really means, selecting on a dependent variable.
When we talk about selecting on the dependent variable, what we mean is looking for the cause of something by looking at the result. And of course, the difficulty with that is it may be that something else is causing the result. And so, for instance, if one wants to understand whether sanctions improve the human rights performance of a country, you can't just look at countries that have had sanctions. What you really need to do, if you want to be scientific about it, is look at countries that haven't had sanctions as well as countries that have had sanctions, and then see whether there's an improvement in the human rights performance only of the countries that have had the sanctions. So that's the notion of selecting on the independent variable. Another way of putting it, which was famously attributed to Karl Popper in his work on falsificationism, is when you're trying to evaluate a hypothesis in science, you're not really looking for confirming evidence. What you're looking for is disconfirming evidence. And if you can't find disconfirming evidence, you have better reasons for entertaining the hypothesis as provisionally true unless something better comes along. Yeah.
Thank you. So the second question that is conceptual is on your lecture on a unipolar world. And I know you presented us with those 3 lenses on politics. And I know that international relations scholars, they might be more familiar with the terms realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And a few students were wondering if you could still, again, go over what these terms mean.
Sure. I think both in study of international politics and in the study of domestic politics, these concepts come up. So as we said, one is to focus basically on people's interests or the interests of entities such as countries. And that is sometimes called a materialist view, sometimes called a realist view. It may or may not be a Marxist conception of people's interests. It could be a neoclassical economist perception of people's interests. But the basic idea is that interests, sometimes conceived of as self-interest, are the main determinants of political outcomes. When we focus on institutions, it's a different set of considerations. It's whether institutions that are basically sets of rules through which interests must play themselves out shape what comes along in politics. And so, again, if you look at national politics, people will look at institutions like political parties or whether separation of powers or independent courts make a difference to political outcomes. In the international system, institutions tend to be international institutions such as the United Nations, the World Bank, perhaps alliances like NATO. Some will say these institutions are really important. Others will say no, when the chips are down, nations just follow their interests and they ignore international institutions. And so they're not that important. And then the third concept is the idea of ideas or ideologies or cultures, beliefs, which are neither interests nor institutions, but rather interventions based on what people think should happen for a variety of reasons. Now, some people think that these are hugely important in politics, and some people think they are completely irrelevant in politics. And again, they go under different labels. They can be, in the study of international relations, they talk about constructivism. I'm trying to avoid ism words in this course because I think they often make it difficult for people to follow what you're talking about. And there's far too much rubbing isms up against one another for my taste in the social sciences. And so, what I said in the class and what I'm hoping to illustrate as we go along is that it's not which one of these views is correct, but rather what are the conditions under which interests are more important, what are the conditions under which institutions are more important, what are the conditions under which ideas are more important in explaining political outcomes. And so, for example, much of the time, interests as mediated through institutions determine most of what happens. But then if a set of institutions fails, there might be a moment at which ideas can be very important because everything becomes fluid and there's going to be a new institutional order created. Nobody quite knows what it's going to be. And so then ideas might be very important, but then things will go to some new equilibrium, which will last for a long time, perhaps, or for a short time. And if it starts to break down, then there might be other moments when ideas can be very important. So we'll see coming up in the course that 2008 turns out to be one of those moments because in the run-up to 2008, the confidence in the Washington Consensus was so great that people who had contrarian ideas really were shouting at the wind. But after 2008, that changes. And so there become possibilities for new development models to get established and start to propagate themselves. So that's the sort of way in which we use these categories.
So this is actually an excellent transition to the next question we received. I know you also talked about the Washington Consensus, and obviously it's the set of policies that are meant to take economic liberalism to a global stage. And it is based on this overconfidence in the West during the time that liberalism and privatization, deregulation is the one-size-fits-all solution to poverty and creating economic growth. So one student was wondering, sort of what of the lessons of the Washington Consensus are still relevant today, and what else have we learned over the past 30 years, and what can be revised in these policies?
So those are excellent questions, and we're going to deal with them in greater depth in the later part of the course. But just to address them in a preliminary way now, the Washington Consensus, again, has basically three components: privatization, deregulation, and free trade, sometimes called neoliberalism, usually when we're talking about within national economies as opposed to policies that the IMF, the World Bank, and others are making conditions for aid in the developing world. So the Washington Consensus, I think, is very much on the defensive. In today's world, it's on the defensive really from on two different fronts. One is that after 2008, the confidence that people had that the Washington technocrats knew what they were doing was greatly undermined, and that played itself out. First of all, countries like China, which had largely accepted much of the Washington Consensus, at least as concerned their activities outside of China. But even within China, this is the era when, up through the financial crisis, when the private sector was growing faster in China. After 2008, not only has there been a resurgence of the state sector in China, but China has become much more aggressive about exporting its own development model, which is much more state-based, to the developing world. We'll talk later about China in Africa and China elsewhere, the Silk Road, the going out of Chinese capital. But they're not just exporting capital, they're also exporting ideas. They're also exporting their own development model. They are creating what they call Confucian institutes all over the world to propagate their views about many things, but including ideas about development. And they are inviting people from developing countries to come to China and learn about Chinese management techniques, Chinese models of economic development and growth. So in that sense, indeed, some commentators now have been talking about the Beijing consensus, which is a competitor to the Washington consensus. So that's one way in which it's on the defensive. I think secondly, it has on the defensive in the West and feeds the rise of populist politics that we're going to be talking about later in the course. The perception that the Washington consensus, or the neoliberal diet, if you like, largely worked to the benefit of elites in these countries, and that the insecure workers have had their interests heavily discounted and perhaps actually harmed by it. This has produced the massive increase in protectionist policies being advocated in many countries. Protectionism, both tariffs, barriers to trade, but also limits on the movement of labor, limits on immigration. We're just seeing that today a strike in Detroit being announced. What is one of their principal demands is to stop General Motors from shipping more jobs offshore. They want GM to commit to building new electric cars in plants in the U.S. And part of what's driving it is that Japanese and other car makers that have plants in the South in the U.S., where so-called right-to-work states that are less unionized and less heavily regulated, are producing cars more cheaply than GM is producing them. And so it's a kind of backlash politics against the idea that market logic is beneficial for all.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. The next question is on NATO, and I know that kind of the original mission of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mitterrand, the French president, he really questioned whether NATO should still exist and what its next role is going to be in this unipolar world now. And interestingly, Trump brings up that same narrative where he's saying NATO is obsolete. And students were asking, is he right?
Well, he's right to pose the question, that is for sure, because NATO was a defensive alliance designed to protect its members during the Cold War. And in fact, the few occasions when NATO has been militarily active, it hasn't been to protect its members. In 1999, this was its first military intervention in Kosovo, which was not a NATO member. No NATO member was threatened. And its subsequent activities in Libya and elsewhere, which we're going to discuss later in the course, have nothing to do with protecting NATO members. And so NATO is, to a considerable extent, an organization that's lost its raison d'etre and is looking for a mission, if it's going to exist at all. And, partly the question of Donald Trump is very insistent that everybody should actually spend the 2% of GDP on NATO defense that they're committed to. Actually, the Obama administration was also pressuring them to spend more. on NATO. But of course, it's difficult to do the domestic politics of that in countries where it's not clear what the purpose of NATO actually is. And so I think it is very much up for grabs in that sense. And I would just say another thing about NATO, since it bleeds over into the issues about the European Union, in that the fact that, I mentioned this briefly in the lecture, but it's come up, people have asked me about it since, the fact that the European Union contracted out its security to NATO is one of the reasons why there's not a stronger pan-national European political identity of the sort that was developed in this country after the extremely difficult time the Confederation of States had during the War of Independence. And we then created a much more centralized government with the power to fund and raise armies, and in future wars, people would have a sense of an American identity. And so you know, if you think today, much of the problem in Europe, the ongoing Eurozone crisis, is German resentment at what they see as they're bailing out Greeks and Italians who they think don't work hard enough and spend too much on their welfare states. But of course, in the US, we have net fiscal transfers from states like New York and California to states like Kentucky and Tennessee. But you don't find people from New York and California saying, why are we supporting those people? People see there's a much more sense that the whole country is in one boat. And the fact that Europe does not provide its own security makes it harder to develop that sense of all in one boat, pan-national purpose that's very important when the European Union hits crises, because then people say, well, what are we getting out of this? Why don't we just leave?
And it's interesting that over the years, actually now we see a rise of Euroscepticism, also with the rise of the right, etc. So that will also be interesting to see politically how that turns out.
Yeah.
So my next question combines your lecture on Russia and China. And I know you spent a good amount at the end of the lecture on the Soviet Union and Russia to talk about how corruption is a big impediment to development and growth in Russia. At the same time, when we look at China, corruption levels there are also pretty significant. So one of the questions was, why is corruption such a big problem in Russia? And how did China circumvent the problem or work with it to create its economic miracle that we see today?
So that's also an excellent question. And this brings up my use of Albert Hirschman's exit voice and loyalty to understand the Russian transition. So first of all, the Soviet Union had a transition to a democracy. It now turned out to be a pretty wonky democracy, but nonetheless, it had a political transition to a democracy that China has not had. Right, and so what Hirschman was helpful in illuminating was that part of the price for the peaceful demise of the Soviet political system was corruption. It was because basically, as we know from Hirschman, if the costs of exit are cheaper, people are more likely to exit than to dig in and defend the prevailing order. We'll see that this is part of the trouble with so-called oil curse countries, that if the only game in town is the oil economy, nobody wants to give up their access to control of the oil economy. And if that government controls that access, people are not going to want to give up political power. And if they can grab political power, they will, because it's the only game in town, so to speak. So what happened in the Soviet Union was that the way in which, and I went through several mechanisms by which this happened, but the way in which it became possible for former bureaucrats and politicians who had been part of the Soviet system to either get other political gigs, such as Shevardnadze in Georgia or Yeltsin in the new Russian Federation, and then all of their minions and supporters who went with them, or economic benefits, such as basically looting state assets in one way or another, taking them with them, or getting control of them, as with Gazprom, and then essentially turning chunks of them over to friends and relatives. So you could say that this is an example in politics. Good things don't all go together. That part of the corruption was a byproduct of getting a peaceful transition. Chinese corruption is very different. First of all, there hasn't been a transition, a political transition. So all of those considerations do not arise. Chinese corruption is the standard corruption that plagues almost all authoritarian systems, which is, one of the great things that markets do is generate information. And when you have authoritarian systems, it's very difficult for the people at the top to know what's going on lower down, because the colloquial way of putting this is that communication tends to be kissing up and kicking down. The academic term for this is the principal-agent problem, that the principal, who in this case is the person higher up in the hierarchy, needs to control what his or her agent is doing lower down in the hierarchy. But the information that the principal needs is in the control of the agent. And so that's one of the reasons economists say markets are so good, because markets generate lots of information. Now, political systems are not markets in the same sense. And so, one of the ways in which political systems have managed that is with opposition parties. And indeed, the concept of His Majesty's loyal opposition comes from 18th century Britain, out of exactly this kind of dynamic where His Majesty didn't know whether he could trust His Majesty's ministers, because he didn't know whether to believe what they were telling him. And so the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition was to put into the institutions of government people who were loyal, in this case to His Majesty, but had an incentive to shine light in dark corners, to expose corruption, because they saw themselves as the alternative government in waiting. If His Majesty got displeased with His Majesty's ministers, His Majesty's loyal opposition would replace and that's how we got the beginning of the idea of alternation. So in a command system, you have this problem. And so China, that's one of the reasons there's a lot of corruption in China. And they have managed it by creating some surrogate mechanisms to help with this, particularly at the local level. For instance, in many parts of China, they have village elections that are actually competitive. And it's not really that the councils have much real power, but the party can watch what happens in these elections, and that generates information. And that's information that they find useful to have. And there are also mechanisms to complain about corruption and to hold bureaucrats to account for corrupt practices. So while China has been quite corrupt, it's a different source of corruption, it's a different kind of corruption, and it's not as extensive as the corruption in Russia, partly because Russia is a kind of oil-cursed country and China is really creating a more diversified economy, and partly because the oligarchs in Russia have been so powerful, as we discussed in the lecture. They're not the equivalent of oligarchs in China.
I mean, I find this question also really fascinating, because even economists, they fight about whether corruption is beneficial in the end or hurtful to development. And when we think back to the American Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of corruption. And I know we talked about this, that back then the system was more closed. And so the corrupt money kind of fed back into the system. And well, today we're talking much more about a globalized world. So the corrupt money can also flow outside, and maybe in Russia, like with these offshore accounts, the money was flowing outside and not really feeding back into the economy. So that could also be a reason why it was more
That's
hurtful.
exactly right. If you look at the robber barons in the U.S. in the 19th century, it is certainly true that American industrialization would never have passed muster with respect to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act standards that we impose on developing countries today and on U.S. multinationals operating in developing countries. But it was a different world. First of all, it was less competitive than it is now. And so the costs of running an inefficient system because of corruption were lower. Secondly, the Americans were dealing with their main competitors were people like the British, who had imperial preferences for their colonies and so on. So it wasn't as though it was a level playing field in that sense. And then finally, the point you made, I think is tremendously important, which is most of the corrupt money in America in the 19th century, it didn't sit in the pockets of the robber barons. Most of it was reinvested in the American economy. Whereas, as you say now, the money from corruption in whether it's in South Africa or Uganda or Russia winds up in bank accounts in Cyprus and Switzerland and is not reinvested in those economies. Big difference,
Thank you. So we saw a lot of potential explanations, as I already said, on the relative success of China and Vietnam. Maybe one factor that we have talked about a little bit less is the importance of the communist parties themselves. And maybe it is an ideological fact, maybe it is about the hierarchy of the party and maybe how the elite within the party was structured and the grassroots level, et cetera, that made these systems so successful. So could you please comment on that a little bit?
So I think, they're still called communist systems, but I don't think there's any real sense in which the hierarchy within the Chinese or Vietnamese communist parties believe in communism in a sense of Marx's or Engels or Lenin's ideas about communism, as distinct from, say, the hierarchy in Cuba, which we haven't talked about in the course, but certainly, both Castro's and even the current leadership today are largely ideologically committed to some variant of actually trying to make communism work. I think that Chinese and Vietnam governments are largely, they're authoritarian regimes that use the nomenclature of communism, but they're not really about, they're not interested in nationalizing the private sector. They're not interested in reducing inequality. They're basically interested in economic development and growth, and they're extremely pragmatic about what will work. And they're mostly interested in what will work. And the reason they are now pushing back against the remnants of the Washington Consensus is not because they see an opening to reestablish Marxist ideas. That is a possibility in some countries, and I think indeed the fight going on within the Labour Party in the UK is one wing wants to reassert old style Labour Party ideas that were heavily influenced by Marxism. I think that when the Chinese are expanding the state sector of their economy, it's nothing to do with that. It's just that they think they have found ways to manage planned production, and they see the deficiencies of short-termism in electoral systems that have elections very frequently, and they think they can plan for the long term better. So it's not really about communism at all. Vietnam is mostly in the shadow of the Chinese system. It's more corrupt. It's for a long time been governed by a triumvirate. Almost, some scholars call it even a separation of power system, which seems to be atrophying now. And so, whether they can make that model work over time is an open question. But again, it's not an ideological commitment to any form of communism of the sort that you see in Cuba.
Right. So the last two questions we received are on your lecture on Thursday on the rise of the right in the West. Specifically one on this clip of Margaret Thatcher that we watched, where she was defending her right-wing policies by saying that at least everyone is better off. And she's saying that those people criticizing that there's more inequality now would want the poor to be even poorer in exchange for less inequality. And students were wondering what would be counter-arguments for her point, and how should we think about the relationship between economic growth and inequality? And is there a threshold to inequality after which it becomes morally reprehensible?
Okay, so those are important and related questions. I think that the students themselves should be coming up with what they think would be answers to Margaret Thatcher's argument. I will talk a little bit more about that in upcoming lectures, but she was clearly faster on her feet and more articulate than her interlocutor in Parliament that day in 1990. But for example, one might say the relevant counterfactuals are not the two that she posed, but that it might be the case that there are alternative development models in which everybody would be getting better off, but there would be a different distribution of the new surplus that might be less tilted toward the very wealthy, so that there might be alternative possibilities, and that would be what people should be debating about. Is there a level of inequality that becomes so great that it undermines Western democratic institutions as we know them? I think that there might be two reasons to think that could be the case. One is that if inequality becomes sufficiently great, what I've called elsewhere the empathy gaps in society become enormous, in the sense that the rich cannot imagine themselves in the shoes of the poor. They can't imagine anything. In effect, they can self-insure against any bad possibility. Then the sense that we're all in the same boat starts to dissipate, because it's easier to say, well, move to the suburbs and build more prisons. It's not my problem.
Yeah.
And then the rich have fewer incentives to worry about if you can't imagine any scenario where you could be in the condition of the people at the bottom, it becomes an incentive to ignore them, out of sight, out of mind. And from the point of view of the bottom, people at the bottom, empathy gulfs exist as well, because if people can imagine stepping over a puddle or swimming across a river, but they can't imagine themselves swimming across the Atlantic Ocean. And so if the rich seem to be on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, then from the point of view of the people at the bottom, their incentive to remain committed to the system starts to dissipate, and then they become vulnerable fodder for anti-system parties, for perhaps turning to crime. But the notion that they can, that the American dream is available to them becomes decreasingly credible. And so I think that's can then start to fuel anti-system types of populist politics that can eventually lead to authoritarianism.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So our last question that we received was on the dependency ratio that you also mentioned last time in lecture, and it's basically the amount of the population that is non-working over the amount that is in the working economy. And we're specifically focusing on the aging population and the ones that need care, because, as you said, parents can take care of their children and pay for their expenses. And it is a reality that the population in Europe and the United States is aging. So that places more pressure on the welfare state in these types of economies. And the question is, why has the left not benefited from this pressure, from this aging population? Why have they not come up with programmatic policies that cater towards the need of the aging population?
So that is a subject we'll spend quite a bit of time on later in the course. It varies greatly by country. So, for example, in Britain, where they have universal health care for the whole population, this is a less fraught issue between the parties than it is here. Part of the challenge here is that when Medicare was created in 1965, it basically created single-payer health care for over 65-year-olds, and that was seen as a great achievement, and I think it was a great achievement for old people. But there are two challenges. One is that it can create a kind of generational class warfare, certainly class tensions. But the second is that it splits the potential coalition to create a more universal system, right? Because if you're over 65, and Democratic candidates are talking about Medicare for all, it's not obviously in your interest for Medicare for all, because there's the risk that it'll dilute the benefits you're going to get if the system doesn't change. So. The way in which we have created a partial solution tends to reinforce tensions among the potential coalition for these things. And so it's, I think, a tougher challenge here than it is in a country like the UK. But we're going to spend a lot of time on that in upcoming classes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.